Rise and fall of Russia. For centuries, Russia has seen itself as one of the world's great powers. During his first 2 decades in power, Putin received praise for rebuilding Russia's military and economy. He was also credited with restoring Russia to the top table of international affairs. However, his disastrous invasion of Ukraine has now done much to reverse this progress. If we think about the significant events of 2022, Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine is the first that comes to mind. The outcome of Russia's latest invasion of Ukraine remains unknown 9 months later. The Russian military appears incapable of capturing Kiev or occupying a single portion of the Ukraine. Ukrainian forces have endured 3 months of battlefield success and may well continue to make territorial gains. The war could continue being more drawn out, with neither side capable of making a decisive breakthrough in the near future. Beyond the military implications, the invasion has created millions of Ukrainian refugees. It has also caused many men of military age to leave Russia, had an effect on food and energy supplies, and fundamentally changed the Russian economy. Russia's weakness is not entirely surprising. Since the fall of the Soviet Union, Western commentators have noted the crippling impact of corruption at all levels of the modern Russian government. Some have named the Putin regime a mafia state, with the lines between the authorities and the organised crime blurred in recent decades. Post-Soviet Russia. Corruption thrived under Putin in the stagnant environment left over from the late Soviet era. Post-Soviet Russia, unlike Ukraine, has never undergone decommunization or recognized the need to reject the Soviet legacy. Instead, Putin has rehabilitated the Soviet era. He centered his vision for a modern Russian national identity on the Red Army's role in defeating Nazi Germany. Efforts to honor Stalin's victims have been silenced. Attempts to recognize the USSR's crimes have been drowned out by a victory cult. It elevated the Soviet World War II experience to the level of a religious cult and re-established Joseph Stalin as a national hero. Putin condemned Russians to another 16 years of stagnation in 2020. He held a referendum on the constitutional reforms that allowed him to extend his reign until 2036. The effects of widespread corruption and stagnation can be seen throughout Russian society, from politics to the economy. This negative impact is especially visible in the invasion of Ukraine. Whereas Ukrainian troops have repeatedly demonstrated the kind of initiative and leadership that one would expect, the Russian military remains hampered by a deeply hierarchical system and the rigid chain of command. On the eve of this year's invasion, the Russian military was widely hailed as the world's second largest army. However, subsequent events in Ukraine have brutally debunked such claims. Putin's army has been exposed in almost every department, from poor leadership and outdated tactics to equally outdated equipment. Chronic corruption within the Russian Ministry of Defense has hampered military logistics. This results in the soldiers receiving equipment dating back to the 1970s or earlier in many cases. It has also become painfully clear that many of the vehicles and weapons listed as part of Russia's vast arsenal only exist on paper. With the war now in its 9th month, chronic supply issues have made Russia increasingly reliant on Iran for drones that it cannot produce on its own. The Russian economy is shrinking. The sanctions are intended to weaken Russia's ability to fund the war. They specifically target the political, military, and economic elite responsible for the invasion. According to the independent research conducted by many accredited sources, early 2022 was a bad year for the Russian economy. Russia's GDP is expected to fall by at least 3.4% in the best-case scenario and up to 5.5% in the worst-case scenario by the end of 2022. In 2023, Russia's economy will continue to contract. In the best-case scenario, GDP will fall by 2.3% year-on-year, while in the worst-case scenario, GDP will fall by 4.5%. The list of prohibited products is intended to maximise the sanctions' negative impact on the Russian economy, whilst minimising the consequences for EU businesses and citizens. Though the economy seems to have improved in 2022, it won't go back to where it was anytime soon. Following Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, the Russian economy appeared hopeless. International sanctions threatened to strangle the economy, causing the financial markets to decrease. Everyday Russians appeared to be on the verge of starvation. These flaws have exposed the mainly cosmetic nature of Russia's somewhat military reforms over the last 2 decades. In reality, Putin's Russian army is largely a Soviet relic with a distinct Soviet political culture that allows Russian commanders to treat soldiers with contempt. This disregard for troops is mostly visible in the treatment of recently mobilized Russians. Many have been sent to the front lines in Ukraine with little training and inadequate equipment. Damage to Russia and its military. The human cost of Russia's military failures in Ukraine has been extraordinary. According to the most recent Ukraine Military of Defense data, an estimated 100,000 Russian soldiers were killed during the first 8 months of the invasion. While this is debatable, even the most conservative independent analysis indicates that tens of thousands of Russians were killed. This makes the Ukrainian invasion far deadlier than the 9-year Soviet campaign in Afghanistan. It resulted in the loss of 15,000 Soviet troops and was widely cited as a factor in the USSR's demise. The Russian military has suffered significant equipment losses. According to the Oryx website, 8,000 pieces of equipment were destroyed, damaged, abandoned or captured. This included 1,500 tanks, 700 armoured fighting vehicles and 1,700 infantry fighting vehicles. Oryx warns that its figures understate the true nature of the Russian losses because it only counts equipment for which it has a unique photo or videographic evidence of its fate. Impact of Russia's invasion of Ukraine on the markets. The invasion of Ukraine has also exposed other areas in which Russia today falls far short of superpower status. Unlike China and other rising powers, Russia's economy has never been diversified or modernized. Instead, the country's ruling elite have prioritized amassing massive personal fortunes. As a result, Russia today is still heavily reliant on commodity exports and lacks the technological equivalents of China's Huawei or South Korea's Samsung. Russia has struggled to produce sophisticated weapons and has reportedly resorted to cannibalizing elements of household appliances in some cases. Russia's over-reliance on the export of energy and arms appears to have been a strategic mistake. International demand falls as a result of the invasion of Ukraine. The EU has weaned itself off Russian gas earlier than expected. It will enter 2023 with a high level of energy independence from the Kremlin. European customers are abandoning Russian energy. Moscow will struggle to find enough alternative buyers for gas in the coming year, owing to Russia's lack of investment in LNG. Poor leadership, poor tactics, poor logistics, and a poor showing against a smaller and less well-armed foe have shattered Russia's military reputation. This will have an effect. Russian weapons exporters' share of the global arms export has fallen by 26% over the last decade. Countries looking to purchase weapons will likely look elsewhere. This international isolation has highlighted Russia's fundamental geopolitical weakness and the lack of any meaningful message behind Moscow's anti-Western posturing. Putin's efforts to portray Russia as a champion of traditional values have fallen flat. In reality, Russia has significantly higher rates of abortion, divorce, suicide and alcoholism than most European countries. Russians have a much lower life expectancy and are significantly poorer than their European counterparts. The plundering of household goods from Ukrainian homes reflects this poverty. Russia is on the verge of a historic defeat in Ukraine, which will have far-reaching consequences for how Russians perceive their own country and themselves. Failure in Ukraine will undermine Putin's Russia's imperial identity. It will force the Russian people to confront decades of nationalistic myth-making perpetrated by the rapacious elites. It is far too early to predict what kind of Russia will emerge from the ruins of Putin's Ukraine invasion. Still, it already appears unlikely that the country will be regarded as one of the world's superpowers. Rise. The Russian economy has largely resisted unprecedented sanctions from the West. According to The Economist, citing a sharp increase in revenues from oil and gas exports, Russian consumer spending is increasing again, interest rates are falling, and the ruble is stronger than it was before the Ukraine conflict erupted. According to The Economist, the ruble is now as valuable as it was previously due to capital controls and high interest rates. The Russian currency was stronger than before the conflict. It is up from $66 to $81. Russia is also continuing to pay its foreign currency bonds, despite attempts by the United States and United Kingdom to force it into default. According to Sberbank, Russians are once again spending fairly freely on cafes, bars and restaurants. In late April, the Russian central bank reduced the key interest rate from 17% to 14%. The Economist notes that the predictions that the Russians' GDP will fall by 15% this year are starting to look pessimistic. The war proved to be longer than expected. However, Russia is slowly gaining back its economy and other losses. It has not entirely fallen, but it will be hard to gain what's lost in a short time. Well, that's it for today. What do you think about the invasion of Ukraine? If you have found this video interesting, do check out this one too. Don't forget to like and subscribe and share this video around.